even better as we dive into our message for this morning. All right, so I want to start together, though, this morning with a little fun trivia for you guys. And so I even got music to go with it. Little trivia for you as we dive in, all right? 7 days in a week. I want you to identify the week. This is the day a week when people on average report the lowest mood and the highest fatigue, right? Kind of think of it mentally. I got a few questions for you. All right, you got it in your mind? All right, next question. This is the day of the week where adults and students tend to see a spike in stress hormones. Next question. Traffic accidents, workplace mishaps, and general errors tend to peak on this day compared to others. Noticing a trend yet? Number 4, email inbox typically explode on this day of the week, making it the most overloaded digital communication day of the week. And finally, this is the day of the week that records the highest suicide rate. On such a positive note like that, here's some music. All right, so what do all of these questions have in common, right? What is the answer? Monday, yes, Monday. Monday is the answer to all of those questions. And my question for you then is what is it about Monday? Right? What is it about Monday that our culture hates? Right? Why does it impact our mood and our stress levels and our behavior in such a way like that? Again, right? What is it about Monday that we hate? Right? I mean, there have been songs sung about this. I mean, there's everything, right? We don't like Monday. What is it about Monday we don't like? For many people, Monday is the day that they go back to the normal rhythms of life. Right? All the fun things you do on Saturday and Sunday, all in come Monday. When you go back to school, you go back to work, you go back to whatever kind of that normal rhythm of your life is. So as we enter into this conversation this morning, I want to propose an answer to you for that question. What is it about Monday? Well, maybe it isn't that we hate Monday. There's nothing wrong about that day in the week. But maybe what we hate as a culture and as individuals is what we do on Monday. Right? We have a distorted view of really kind of our calling in life. Because often what happens is we think of Monday like our culture thinks of Monday. Right? We've inherited in many ways the mindset of Mondays as everyone else in the world. We view work often as a necessary evil. Right? I go to work because I needed to make money to eat. Right? We view it as a means to an end. Right? I go to work to make some money so I can have fun on the weekend. And what happens as well as we think about this topic of work, and this is a very big topic, and I'm going to do my best I can to kind of move through it in a systematic way. But as I'm talking about work, I want you to realize, too, that even our culture often doesn't validate work in which you're not paid for. Right? There's a lot of retirees that serve in different capacities. There's a lot of stay-at-home moms that work incredibly hard. And often, right, when we think of even work, we don't think of work that doesn't draw an income, but it's work. Often, right, when we think of work in our culture, we pursue it because we do it so we can eventually get to what we want to do. Again, looking forward to the weekend. And so what happens is there's this distorted view of work in our culture that we have assessed as well. And so what happens is we end up looking forward to retirement, right? The day we can stop working. We dream of that rich uncle who passes away and leaves us millions of dollars where we never have to work again. Winning the lotto, finding a job that allows us to do less work. And so what we have here is a distorted view of work, and I'm kind of laying the theological groundwork here today. But in summary, what happens, why we hate Monday, is because what it signifies. It signifies work, the normal rhythms of life. School is work, for sure. And we think of work as being bad. We think of work as something to be avoided. This isn't the biblical perception. We are called to have a much different perception of work, and this is what we're going to dive into over the next 6 weeks. Sorry to disappoint you, we're not in 1 Corinthians anymore. We're moving to a new series that, quite frankly, has been kind of challenging for me to prepare, because there's so many topics that interact with this conversation of work and faith. And today, what we're going to talk about is this perception of work, kind of laying the theological groundwork that'll guide the next 5 weeks as we deal with topics such as rhythms of work and rest and calling in work and place and purpose. But if you want, go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 1. We're going to primarily be there this morning looking at chapter 1, verse 26 to 28. As we start this new series, I entitled Mondays Matter. Right, we're having discussions on the intersection of work and faith. And today we're going to talk about this topic of design as it relates to work, as we attempt to answer a lot of different questions of the why and what that surround work and our faith. Such as, right, why do we work? Right, why did God build work into his creation? Why do we struggle to work so much? Why is it such a hard thing for us to do? What is work supposed to accomplish? What does it mean to have a biblical understanding of work, and how does it interact with my faith? Right, this is a very broad topic. There's a lot of stuff that is included in this, and I just want us today to kind of lay a groundwork. So the question, right, what realities should change our perception of work? Well, 7 years ago, Paige and I visited Las Vegas, and we partied it up. Actually, we didn't. We're incredibly boring people. One thing that I really wanted to do while we were there is visit the pawn shop, right, from the show Pawn Stars. Right, this is what captivates my attention, right? We went and saw a Supercross race, and then we went and saw the pawn shop and a show. And if you're not familiar with the show, Pawn Stars from the History Channel centers upon a family running a pawn shop in Las Vegas, and the fun thing is they buy weird, exotic, and often historical items, and obviously they're a business. They're buying them to flip them to make a profit. And so one of the fun things about the show, at least for me, is the educational part. Right? This is really kind of a more modern-day Antiques Roadshow, if you remember that. And so as they bring in these different items, they'll sometimes call in experts to advise them on things, or these guys are really smart as well. They have a lot of knowledge in this area. And so they'll spend time talking about the background, the history of the different item brought in. And every now and then, say if you watch it, once a day for a week, about at least one show in a week, you'll get somebody that comes in with this item that was passed down. They have this amazing story that passed down from their great-grandfather to them, and they talk about this item and how it was acquired, and they assume that this item is worth a lot because it's very rare, and their family has protected it closely. And they'll bring it to the shop. Often they're like, I'm not really interested in selling unless I can get $1 billion for it. And the guys look at it. They call an expert in, and then they get the bad news that what they own is a fake. It's maybe a good high-quality reproduction, but it's a fake. And then they go into details telling them about how they know that item is a fake. Right? They know that there's sometimes these small, subtle signs that it's not real. That was kind of cool. Sometimes even the fakes, the high-quality reproductions, have value as well. But the purpose I want to just kind of bring up is, as you look at this, when they're trying to assess whether something's real or fake or a reproduction, no matter what, when you make a reproduction of something, you bear the image of the original. The fraudster, the fake who made it, wants to make it look as much like the original as possible. But often there's never a perfect copy. And so I mention that because as we talk about work today, again, we're laying the theological foundation. I wanted you to understand that we are copies in many ways of the original, right? We are designed to be image bearers of God. So the first blank for you, what reality should change our perception of work? We are created to reflect God. We are image bearers. We're going to kind of flesh this out a little bit, but all people, right, all humanity reflect the original, even though, quite clearly, we're not perfect copies. This term is often used in the Latin, the imago Dei, right? It means image of God. And I bring this up again, laying some foundation for today, because as image bearers of God, this should impact the way we view work. So I want to direct your attention to Genesis 1, 6 to 28. We're primarily be in this text today. We're going to look at it multiple times and honestly only scrape the surface of this conversation, but I want to introduce you to it here. Genesis 1, chapter 26, chapter 1, verse 26 to 28, part of the creation narrative. This section starts out, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on earth.'" Here is kind of the foundation for this conversation for us today and for theologians throughout centuries as we talk about humans being made in the image of God. So what does it mean to be made in the image of God? I want to direct your attention to the first verse there, the first part of the first verse, in verse 26. God said, right, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." Now, as you look at that, if you're a pretty good theologian, grew up in church, you see that plural word, us, and it would seem that maybe God is talking with himself, right? He's in communion with himself, suggesting a plurality of God, right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It makes sense. But that phrase is used kind of throughout Genesis, and quite clearly it's not just God he's talking to. It's used elsewhere, and in fact, many scholars, and there's a lot of conversation about this, but many scholars understand him here as addressing a heavenly court. And that doesn't mean that we are made in the image of angels, but angels also have some human characteristics as well, or you should say God-like characteristics, right? They possess qualities that God has and we possess as well. And so maybe their role in this process was the worship of God during this creative process, right? It's like, you often will watch things on YouTube and someone's like, "Hey, let's go on a journey." You're not going on a journey, you're watching them go on the journey, but you're celebrating as they do that. So you see this kind of creative start out, making man in his image. Verse 27, if you're confused, if you think, okay, we're made in the image of angels, it's cleared up very quickly. So God created man, verse 27, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. A very direct statement to let us know, right? We are made in the image of God. So it's kind of interesting there, too, is the intentional note about two genders being created as well. Right, so this creation process is incredibly intentional. And we, as human beings, bear the mark of God on us. But again, I have not answered the question. If you haven't noticed, I've been talking around it, and I'm going to talk around it a little bit more here. What does it mean, though, to be made in God's image? As you read through the creation narrative, God made a lot of things during creation. He made a lot of living organisms and animals. And he said that they were created and they reproduced according to their kind. But when God comes to man, he does something different. Mankind is created in the image of God. But yet again, right, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Sometimes we would think that means maybe we bear the physical representation of God. But that's not accurate, right? Because if you understand theology well, God the Father is spirit. And we're not floating spirits, right? We're not floating around. What it means is that we share elements of his nature with him, his communicable attributes. So we share attributes with God, right? We bear the mark of God really through our design. God has a great capacity for love and for relationship, and he's given it to his creation. He's given it to us. We have the capacity to love and have relationships with others. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but God has a great capacity for creativity. He displays compassion and mercy. And as image bearers of him, we are incredibly creative individuals and have the capacity to show mercy and compassion as well. We reflect his character. And all of this is important because as we talk about being made in the image of God, as image bearers of him, It means that every single human being, born or unborn, throughout history, every single person, because they bear the image of God, they have dignity, they have value, and they have worth. Again, kind of still dancing around it a little bit. And again, there is volumes and volumes of conversation about being made in the image of God. What does this fully mean? For today, I want to focus on kind of two elements of that. And the first part I want to focus on is the fact that we are called to be his representative. Right? We bear the mark. We live out in many ways characteristics of him. Abraham Kurvilla, as he's discussing this text and as he's talking about being made in the image of God, makes this statement that I think might clear things up a little bit. He says, the role of mankind was to represent God to every other part of God's creation, to make God tangible, if you will, to the world. And this is very important because it relates to how we live, how we work. We are made to bear his image, and we bear his image in every part of our life, especially how we spend Monday through Friday. We serve as representatives of him. Right? We are making him known to the world through the very way in which we work and we live. And this is really interesting as you flesh this out, as you study different views of God and different theological backgrounds. Because when you look at the Greek gods, when you look at gods throughout history that people have talked about, there is no God like our God. Because God intentionally created human beings to represent him, and he has given them a very royal and important task. Right? This is the God that we serve. When you look at many other gods through mythology, they were created, and they just sit around passively. They don't do much. Many humans are like a side thought. And so God has created us with intention and with purpose. And he designed us from the beginning to resemble him and bear evidence of him. And again, laying the theological foundation, but this is important for us as we think about work, how we are to interact with what we do Monday through Friday. Because the proper view of work has to go back to the design, has to go back to the designer. So as we think about how we interact with work in our faith, one question we need to consider is, what does God think about work? Right? How does God work? How does he approach the task of working? These questions need to serve as the basis for this conversation. So as you consider your thoughts about labor, as you consider your thoughts about work, I want you to begin to consider matters of design, how you've been created. Because we have been created to work. Yes, it's frustrated because of the fall, and we'll get into that in another week. Our work is frustrated because of sin, but from the very beginning, before sin entered the world, we were commanded to work. God works. So we need to be careful allowing our culture to shape our understanding of work, because often culture's understanding of work is a distortion of God's design for in our lives. I think it's a powerful reminder for us of how we've been created. Every single one of us were created with a sense of purpose and intentionality. And our lives are to reflect that, especially what we spend the majority of our time doing, and that is working. So we're called to reflect God. Years ago, I remember my dad buying a computer for my grandmother, really kind of just for simple task. I think he had like Windows 98 on it, right? That's how far back it goes. Simple task, for my grandmother. She's not doing anything too crazy, but to send emails, to surf the internet, to create documents. Nothing major, just kind of simple task. And really all she ever used it for, though, was to play solitaire. And I remember, I'm a young kid, I remember my dad giving my grandmother a hard time, saying like, man, maybe he should just bought her a deck of cards, right? This thing could do so much more than just play solitaire. But my grandma was just happy playing solitaire on that computer. And it's kind of interesting, right? You have this device, this computer that can do so many things. Yet you use it for one thing. It could do so much more, yet we limit it to one thing. And I want you to consider this as well. When you think about work, often we think about work in a one-dimensional capacity. We think about work as simply a place that we go and collect a paycheck to kind of make it through the week, to do the things that we really want. And if that's how you think about work, I want to let you know you're missing out on so much more. right? You got that computer and you're just playing solitaire, but there's so much more you could do with it. And God intends work to be so much more than you going there, collecting a paycheck just to survive. It is the primary means by which you represent God. So, what realities need to change our perception of work? We need to understand that work is a fundamental part of our design and our calling. Work is a fundamental part of our design and our calling. Now I want to go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28. There's a lot more to mine in here that we're just going to scrape the surface today. But if we look at this text, I want you to pay attention to the construction of this passage because it alternates between two major themes. I'm going to read through it and I'm going to call attention to each one as we walk in. First part of verse 26 said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So there we see design, a level of intentionality. But then it shifts there from design to calling. He says, "And have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens, earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So you shift from design, purpose, to calling. This is where they're placed to live out that purpose and that calling. But then he shifts again to design, verse 27. "So God created man in his own image, and in God he created him. Male and female he created them." A back and forth process. Design, calling. Design, calling. Design, calling. Verse 28 touches on calling. So within this passage intertwined is this picture of design and purpose, right? Design, calling. Design and place. And so we, just like Adam and Eve, serve as representatives of him. And so our work represents him. I want you to note the task that God gives humans. Let me go back. Look at the second part of verse 26. He tells them, "Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over all the livestock and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Right? So the task that God gives them is important. It's a level of sovereignty. They have control, responsibility over all of creation. They have a very important task. Remember, they're image bearers of God, living out characteristics of him. They're image bearers of dominion. Hop down to verse 8, effectively a repeat of verse 26. Intentional. He says, "Be fruitful, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it." Again, you see this level of sovereignty that man has. And as many of you know, and I know you guys know this really well in our community, we ultimately are stewards of what we've been given. Yeah, on paper you own the land, but you're just stewarding it for a short amount of time. The animals that you care for, you're called to steward. There's a level of responsibility given to Adam and Eve here and given to us as well. So our design interacts with our calling, and we'll get into more of that in the weeks to come because that's probably, I think, the biggest question people have. What is my calling? How does this fit in with my faith? But again, we're laying the theological groundwork today of Imago Dei, right? The image of God. Genesis 15 through 17, a little bit more of the creation narrative. You see man placed in the garden, and he's given the task of working. And then he's given free will. Verse 15, "God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it." Again, this work was given before sin entered into the world. This is a fundamental part of our design. Verse 16, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." So God places man in the garden and gives them a task, gives them a calling per se. And they could choose obedience or disobedience. They can choose to follow God and their design, or they can turn against it. And as we know, man chose to throw up his fist, rebel against God. Sin enters the world, and it corrupts everything. And it changes fundamentally how man works. And again, we'll get into more of that as the week goes on. But this sin, again, impacts everything, and it tarnishes man's ability to reflect God well. It creates conflict with our design. And now, because of that, we reject the image of God in our lives. This is a fundamental reason why people hate Mondays. They reject the fact that they have to work and to labor, yet that is a fundamental part of our design as we represent our God who labors and works. We twist the intended purpose and motivation of work. So what does this all mean? A couple things that we see here. And again, we're just scraping the surface of this conversation. Our work is not about us. It's intended to be a form of worship. As you'll see, hopefully, as we move through this conversation over the next 5 weeks, as you work according to the way in which God designed you, God is glorified. Our work isn't about us. And also, another thing I want you to see as well, this image of never doing anything ever again goes against our fundamental design. We were never intended to be idle, right? Not all work involves a paycheck. And so what happens is sometimes during different seasons of your life, work looks different, right? You might retire from a job where you're collecting a paycheck, but God still calls you to be busy, to be his representative in different places of life. The management of anything requires that we steward resources well. God calls us to steward people well. As we love them and lead them, as we provide services for others, as we create products that benefit our fellow man. And this involves even stewarding and leading yourself well. God calls us to be busy, right? Work is a fundamental part of our design and our calling. The summer before Paige and I were to graduate from college, we had made plans to drive to Dallas to visit the seminary that I planned to attend. We figured if we're going to dump thousands of dollars there, move there, and spend a good portion of our life there, we should probably visit first. And so we made plans to drive from Jacksonville, Florida to Dallas, Texas, and neither of our cars were capable of that drive, and so we decided we needed to rent a car to do this drive. Now, I'm not sure if you've rented a car anytime recently, but if you're under the age of 25, they literally charge you double, which always blew my mind because I'm just as responsible for that car whether I'm under the age or not, right? I still got to fix it. Still got to make things right. So I knew this, and so I'm trying to find a car that fits my budget, very small window, and most of them, as they're charging double, this is not working, so I call around to a number of different rental agencies. And I eventually found a place that, as I'm explaining my age and telling them what I want to do, they said, oh yeah, we don't charge a surcharge because of your age. And so I'm like, okay, great, let me make a reservation. I'll be there in a few weeks to pick it up. So fast forward, the day before we're supposed to leave, do this trip to Dallas. I go to pick up that car, and as I'm getting this invoice, they tack on that extra charge. And it was really frustrating, right, because I had a budget set for this trip, and that just blew my budget. And I was upset. I felt like I'd been lied to. And they chalked it up to, it was probably true, a bit of a misunderstanding, right? The person I spoke to at the desk that day was not the person I spoke to over the phone, right? They insisted maybe the person misspoke, maybe I misunderstood. They said, no one ever does this. Why would you think that? Because you told me. They were apologetic, but ultimately were unable to honor the conversation that we had over the phone. Now, is that one experience representative of the whole company? I would say yes and no. It doesn't necessarily tell me everything about that company, but it tells me something about it. And like it or not, right, as image bearers of God, that means that the very nature of how we serve him reflects something about him. So whether you serve him well or you don't serve him well, it communicates something about who we are bearing an image of. And this is really important for us, and it's a little nuanced conversation, but it's important for us as we think about design. We need to understand that work is an avenue through which we reflect God. Right? Just like that car rental company, that one interaction I have with that local office reflects the corporate office, the corporate picture of the company. We reflect something about our Creator as well when we work. So I mentioned as image bearers of God, what that means is we don't necessarily look physically like him, but we have characteristics like him. And so it's important for us to reflect on our God. What characteristics do we see in God when he is busy, when he is at work? Well, we see from the very beginning that we serve a God who is active. We serve a God who is incredibly creative. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created what? The heavens and the earth. Right? He's active, he's busy. As you look at what he created, what he spoke into existence, you see his creativity on full display. John 5:17. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. Right? God is not sitting around. He is a busy and active God. Conversation in John was part of the conversation on the Sabbath. And the reality is, even when God rests, there is work being done. Because if God stopped, whole world would cease to exist, right? All nature and life would come to a halt. Our God is incredibly active. He rests as a model for us. And again, we'll get into that in the weeks to come. But our God is active. So as we bear the image of God, we're called to be active in some capacity, right? Often we think of work where we're drawing a paycheck. But again, even into retirement, even into a different season of life, we're still called to be active, not just sit around at home and do nothing. We're called to serve. We're called to be creative. We're called to solve problems. We serve an active God, and if our faith and work are going to interact, we need to be active as well. But again, as I mentioned already, we serve a God who's active but also creative. Psalm 139, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. Incredibly creative. I've met a lot of people that, man, he did a job on, right? God is very creative. To be made in his image, to work representatives of him, we are exercising that creativity. The whole Genesis account is full of his creativity. But we also serve a God who is active and creative, but he's working towards something. There is an ends to what he's accomplishing. Genesis 2, verses 2 through 3, you see this sense of completion, and he rests at the end of it as a model for us, and we'll talk about that again in weeks moving forward here. But God starts, and he completes stuff. You see this once again, too, in Psalm 33, verse 9. You see him starting something. He spoke it. It came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm. He starts, and he completes things. So when you go back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, you see God place Adam and Eve right in the garden. He gives them a task. He commands them to have dominion and subdue the earth. Right? They are called to be active. That is an active act. He calls them to be creative. When you think of the task that they had to choose the names for all these animals. There's a level of creativity there. There's a lot of problem solving that goes on in the elements of being creative. They were expected to work and to accomplish a task, to be productive. So they are given a very specific task. And as we begin to kind of wrap this up, when we think of being made in the image of God, when we think about being created to work, we need to consider that God calls each and every one of us to be active, to be creative, to be productive. Certainly, there's seasons of rest. God's okay with you taking a vacation, right? Taking a few personal days to slow down and enjoy life. But God expects us to be active, just as he is, right? We aren't to sit around, right? We are to be busy and at work, moving toward something, even if we don't draw a paycheck from it. So we're called to be active, we're also called to be creative. And I hope you see this in your field of work, right? Literally in your field of work, when you are planting this spring, you have a lot of creativity there. And you might ask Justin, how, right? I'm doing the same thing my grandfather did. Well, you encounter problems every single day, and you got to get creative on how to solve those problems, do you not? Right? You got to design and build different systems and processes for different things, right? You're strategizing on how to get the yields out of your fields. You got to be creative, and as you do that, as you work with excellence, you are representing God. We're called to bring excellence to the mundane and the simple tasks. This is what it means to be creative. It's not just being artistic like we like to think. And we're also called to be productive, to do something that matters, to innovate, to manage time and resources well. All of these things that we do when we're at work, we bear the image of God by how we work, how we represent him. And so maybe, again, for you, you think of going to work tomorrow and your heart kind of sinks a little bit. And again, this is a different conversation. There is a place for calling and purpose, and we'll get into that. Maybe you're not in the line of work that God has called you for, so you have. But maybe, when you get a little deeper, it's not Monday, it's not work that's a problem for you. It's that you have a flawed understanding of how God designed us. He designed us for purpose. He designed us to work. And as we do that, we reflect him. So I want us to begin this process of transforming our thoughts about work, why God has placed it in our in our lives, why God has designed this as a part of our being, how it actually represents our Creator. And to do that this week, again, we're going to have 5 more weeks in this conversation dealing with different topics. But to do that this week, we begin to think about questions for you, just to evaluate your own heart. Do I treat work like a burden or see it as part of my design? And how can I reflect God more clearly in my work? So let's bow our heads in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for just the opportunity to come together this morning to open up your word and talk about something so fundamental to who we are. That is, Lord, what we do Monday through Friday. And Lord, I pray that each person who's here today, as they consider what they're walking into on Monday, Lord, that as they consider the task in front of them, Lord, that they see their work as a calling, as they see it being representative of you, a way to bear your image. And so, God, I pray for the individual, Lord, who is, struggling with what takes place tomorrow. Lord, may you begin to work in their lives to help them understand why you've placed this task in front of them, and even help them wrestle with real questions, Lord, if that's even where you've called them to be. But ultimately, Lord, I just pray for us as we serve as representatives of you. May we be better image bearers. Because, God, we love you, and we struggle to get this right, and we need help. Lord, help us to honor you in every single thing we do, particularly the way in which we work, the way in which we labor. God, we love you. Help us with this. In your name, amen.